the MENA Talks, a podcast series by the BIC on the Middle East and North Africa. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will explore underlying historical, economic, social and political drivers behind today's systemic issues in the MENA region. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Shada Islam, senior commentator at BIC Brussels International Centre here in Brussels, and this is the first episode of the MENA Talks podcast. So, as Russia's aggression against Ukraine rages on and signs point to a painful prolongation of the war, the world is changing. It's actually already changed in myriad irrevocable ways. Shockwaves from the conflict have destroyed hopes of any quick post-COVID global economic recovery, and the war is playing havoc with the economies of already fragile pandemic-hit nations. Famine and food insecurity stalk many states. Some of these questions are finally beginning to get some attention, but there's another important transformation underway, and that's what we call the great geopolitical reordering. The Ukraine war has accelerated the emergence of a truly multipolar world, where countries have the know-how, the agency, as well as the self-confidence to reject a binary choice between two opposing camps. Most countries today operate in a mix and match mode where they can select and choose between the best available deals which align with their key interests. And I think this shift is not getting the attention it deserves because for too many Western nations, this is a painful recognition of a loss of power and influence. But need it be so? To discuss this with me are Dr. Sven Biscop, Director Europe in the World at the Egmont Institute, and Professor Hwee, Director at the EU Asia Center in Singapore. Sven, I'm going to start with you. Let's hear your thoughts. Would you, Sven, agree that we're moving, perhaps slowly, but really irrevocably towards a world which is not unipolar, which does not work around the United States, and it's not even bipolar, not around the US and China, but towards a real multipolar landscape?
Thank you, Shada. You know, my point of view is that the world has been multipolar for a long time, actually. At least until 2007, 2008, when I think in the wake of the financial crisis, China entered the scene as a great power. But the interesting thing is, if you read Paul Kennedy's famous book on the rise and fall of great powers, he quotes none other than Richard Nixon in the 1970s, saying that already then the world in economic terms was really multipolar. Of course, he was not thinking of China at the time, but of Japan. But as Nixon said, the economic power is the basis of political power. So my view is the world has been multipolar for much longer than we think. But I do think that one takeaway of the Ukraine war so far is that it confirms that the world is multipolar for me. By that I mean that you have a number of powers. Some of them are closer to each other than to others. For example, China is clearly closer to Russia than to the EU or to the US, but none of them are so close that they will let their relations with the others be determined by their partner. So in the end, China pursues its own priorities, its own interest, and it will not let its relations with the EU be determined by its relations with Russia. So in that sense, I think the world is already distinctly multipolar and will be for years to come.
Hwee, let's get your thoughts on this. The world has been multipolar for many years, says Sven. Would you agree?
Yes, I think basically I agree with Sven's idea that, since I think we could say that from the great financial crisis of 2000 to 2007, 2008, there's this shift, of course, the rise of China and all that. But I would say we are actually in a much more complex and multidimensional world. It is multipolar, but we could also see different regional orders. In different regions, you have different for instance, when I look at Europe now, I would say that it's almost towards another bipolar Cold War kind of a situation, right? Whereas in Asia, it's clearly multipolar. You have many different actors, and this very dynamic situation. So it's a very multipolar, multilateral world in Asia. And then of course, if you look at America, you could say that it's perhaps towards a bit more unipolar, where US still dominates in its own backyard. So I see the world as much more complex, multidimensional, multi-orders, if I may use the term, and we are in for, of course, this very dynamic situation where there are places where the balance of power is much more important, but at the same time, you need balance of power, but you also need the rule-based order, some rules to govern the games. So it's a very complex situation and multidimensional to me.
So isn't it a more, Sven, a question of perceptions, how you see yourself in this world? I mean, this is what Hwee is sort of referring to, isn't it? Asia sees itself and is a multipolar. Europe is sort of going into a Cold War mentality, and the United States still sees itself as the lead power, the dominant hegemon in the world. So these conflicting, almost opposing perceptions of what we are in this very complex and puzzling world.
I think certainly in Europe and in the US, there's a tendency to always divide the world into good and evil. And you see that playing out in the war also in Ukraine. It's portrayed as a war between democracy and authoritarianism. And I would say, yes, it is in the sense that democratic Ukraine is fighting against an authoritarian Russia. But I do not see it as a global battleground of democracy against dictatorship, because the reality is that the EU needs some of the other dictators on its side, if only to import the natural resources that they will now no longer source from Russia. This sort of manichaeist tendency is always there, inspired by a value-based foreign policy agenda. But I think it's an oversimplification that leads Europeans and Americans often to, in my view, misinterpret the world. I always say the world is not driven by values. It's not democrats against autocrats. The world is driven by interests. States pursue their interests and they cooperate with any other state with whom they share an interest, usually quite regardless of the domestic political system of that state. So I would say, especially now, this multipolar world, I mean, it's positive in the sense that the alternative would be a bipolar Cold War, Europeans and Americans against Russians and Chinese. To simplify, but I agree very much with Hwee. It's a very complex multipolar world. And I think what Europeans and Americans will have to learn is that in such a setting, not everybody that we may regard as a partner will be with us on each and every dossier. And you see that, for example, with India, who many in Europe and America would see as a partner, but takes a very different stance on the war in Ukraine.
So, Hwee, that's a very good point that Sven has raised. We're sort of driven by an agenda which sort of pits the democracies of this world, the good guys, if you like, against the bad autocracies. And there is a tendency to simplify one world, two system scenarios. And that's sort of being the predominant narrative in the West. Should the European Union, in your view, be taking that same approach that America tends to take? Because as Sven has said, in this world, there's so many challenges like climate change, poverty, sustainable development, migration, you name it, that require good and bad guys, if you like, working together.
Yeah, I think Sven is completely right that, if you simplify the world into this binary choice, or always good against bad or autocracies against democracies, you're going to limit your possibilities. You're going to limit your room for maneuver, for solving all the global the different challenges we all face. So I think Europe should not fall into this sort of binary kind of mindset. And I think sometimes we see that in Europe and in the US, you tend to try and simplify things, and instead of having to listen more and to try and understand the world. I mean, we have a world which make up of 200 nations, close to 8 billion people, and we have to learn to deal with differences and diversities and how to manage them, how to work with different people with different values. With different value system, different beliefs, perspectives, in order to really, come together to, as you say, when necessary, for some of the common challenges, promote some of the common mutual interests we have, There will always be some areas where our interests coincide, some areas that we may have differences that we need to learn to manage. And I think, sometimes I feel that political leaders who like to simplify things into this kind of binary choice, autocracy against democracy, good against bad, evil against good and evil and all that, are just dumping down on the population. They just think that the people are not smart enough or to understand the complexities of the world, and that they have to speak in that kind of language, right? So it is to me a real problem when I hear this kind of binary choices that the political leaders themselves frame in their policies, or in trying to use it in justifying their policies.
Sven, how does the European Union then, which sees itself as value-based and has always talked about having a value-based foreign policy and security policy, in this world of interest, doesn't it have to adapt and readjust? In fact, isn't that actually happening? I mean, there's the narrative of, we are the kindest, nicest people in the world, and we're out there kind of like a universal NGO kind of outlook. And the reality of hard power being used, being part of a great power competition that's going on in this very complex world. So is the European Union, do you think, ready to change? Is it already changing without actually saying so?
I think there has been a change in the mindset of the EU since about 2012, 13, 14, when I think the EU realized it had been over-optimistic in its assessment of the world. We got the Arab Spring, which led to very little positive change. Then in 2014, we got the initial Russian invasion. And I think at that time came the switch really to a more interest-based approach. But at the same time, my feeling is always that somehow the EU knows that a purely value-based foreign policy, the idea that through conditionality we're going to democratize the world, somehow the EU knows it will not work, and yet it is reluctant to distance itself from the narrative. That, of course, leads to even more double standards than the EU is usually accused of. So in my view, we would really have to think about it clearly. I fear that the democratization agenda has become unfeasible. We do not have the leverage to change the domestic political system of any country except a candidate for EU membership. But that's, of course, a finite number. Of course, I do not advocate that we should also just abandon the general human rights agenda. But again, we should be conscious of our leverage. Certainly towards other powers, we do not have the leverage to force them to change their domestic policies. So my view is call out human rights violations and criticize them whenever and wherever you see them, but don't waste your ammunition by adopting sanctions because of human rights all the time, because it will not work. So keep your powder dry for when certainly a state like China or Russia crosses the line in their foreign policy, and which may directly affect our interests, but keep up the human rights rhetoric, even though you know that in the short term it may not result in much change. But somehow we do the opposite. We often get much more excited about domestic issues, such as the fate of Alexei Navalny in Russia, the fate of the Uyghurs in China, and both suffer horrible fates. Let me be clear on that. But that does in reality not affect our interest, and in reality there is nothing we can do about it except criticizing it. Whereas, for example, when there are continuous hybrid actions and cyber attacks against us, then it seems we are very passive, and I would somehow turn that around.
Hwee, the human rights agenda that Sven is talking about has been a source of tension and strain in the EU's relations with many parts of the world, including, of course, the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific. And what is the point of view of countries in the Asia-Pacific, in the wider world, about when the EU starts talking, still does talk about, or the European Parliament definitely does, about domestic human rights issues? Is that useful? Does that take the issue forward? Does it lead to change?
No, I completely agree with Sven that a lot of this, I think people can keep up with the rat, they will listen, but the sense in Southeast Asia in particular is, of course, this idea that, again, the hypocrisy, because ultimately, they believe that also the European Union is driven by interest, right? So all this human rights agenda is in a way promoted when it doesn't directly affect the interest. So we know in Southeast Asia, they will say that if you look at the way they have treated Myanmar and the way they have treated China, is completely different because, of course, of the different sides, different interests they have in these two countries, right? So going on this human rights and value-based foreign policy grades on the people, I think mainly in Southeast Asia, and they'll rather that the European Union be more upfront. I mean, you can say that it's in my interest to promote some of the values, and I think and then they can understand that kind of language, that they also have to sometimes respond to their own domestic constituency and make this kind of noises and stand up to talk, to criticize about the human rights violations, right? And that, of course, then is if they are upfront about this and people understand, then I think we can come to a sort of acceptance. And I've also, in many in some of my writings into the Southeast Asian media, to say that the Southeast Asians, we like to say that we have our ASEAN way of doing things, right? So we do not want them to come and change us, but at the same time, there's a European way of doing things that we should also accept. So if they want the Europeans to accept the ASEAN way, in some way, the Southeast Asians should also say that there are certain domestic considerations and all that to accept the European way of, and learn to manage that differences. And as I said, sometimes we always use the term, we agree to disagree, and then move on to find convergence. And we always like to say there will be areas we disagree, but we also try to find ways of convergence, build on those areas of mutual interest to move forward. And through there, we can slowly build trust and be able to tackle and come together and work to confront more and more common challenges together.
So Sven, we've taken part in conversations, you and I, at think tanks, where the issue of compartmentalization that Hwee has referred to, you agree to disagree, but you work together in other areas, has come under severe criticism as being sort of accepting that countries can continue to be bad in terms of how they treat their populations. And then, we just sort of go there for commercial or economic interest. This idea that you can sort of compartmentalize problems and work in some arenas while criticizing countries in other sectors. Do you think that idea is gaining traction? Because isn't that the reality of today's world, actually?
I still believe in compartmentalization, and the fact that you cooperate in some areas with a country, even though you criticize in others, doesn't mean that you condone what they are doing. It's not because we are an ally of the US through NATO that we condone the death penalty in the United States, to name an obvious example. But the problem seems to be double. On the one hand, there's this tendency to expand the human rights agenda and to link it to more and more dossiers. You see it especially among national parliaments and in the European Parliament. And to be honest, even though I agree with the principle, if you want, and I think that's a worthy cause, but I think often it's counterproductive, because you cannot change the human rights situation in many countries, unfortunately. So you simply block other dossiers. But also the opposite happens, and specifically, I think in the case of China, the EU did compartmentalize. For example, it announced a comprehensive agreement on investment, and then a few months later adopted human rights sanctions because of the mistreatment of the Uyghur people. But then China overreacted and adopted such massive counter-sanctions that it was China that broke the logic of compartmentalization, which led to the agreement being blocked, and rightfully so. The Parliament says, well, we're not going to ratify any treaty as long as China has sanctions on members of the European Parliament. And there, frankly, I also didn't quite understand why China would think this would be in its interest, because the more China behaves assertively or aggressively and breaks the logic of compartmentalization, the more the idea will gain hold in Europe that China is only a rival, rather than, as the EU now says, a partner, a competitor, and a rival, all at the same time. So I hope that somehow we can find a way, in spite of the massive differences in domestic system, to somehow get the bilateral relationship back on a constructive track.
So, Hwee, you've written recently you were saying, you engage with the media, and you've written recently that the contours of a new global order are just beginning to emerge, but have yet to solidify. What this new global system will look like, you say, depends on how the West will engage with the rest, and that not many countries want to see the world returning to a Cold War era, and the United West should hopefully act with humility and be mindful of its actions on other nations and cultures. Just explain a bit further what you're trying to say here.
Yes, I think from the beginning, I was saying that we shouldn't adopt this binary mindset. When the Cold War ended, I think there was a sense of hubris from the Western powers, on the side of the Western powers, leading to this, instead of adopting a more listening mood, trying to engage and be inclusive, in understand different perspectives, to bring people on board in a sort of a inclusive and humble and open way. There was a much more sort of a desire to impose the value system, and thinking that all the other nations are going to become more like the West. So I hope that mistake has been made, and I hope that now I think there's a chance. We see that in some way can say there's a certain unity of the West again now because of the Ukraine war. And they think, or at least they think, that they are speaking from the point of strength. So I hope that we will not go back to the hubris, to the kind of what we saw in the immediate post-Cold War world, and instead really start to adopt a much more. Again, to me, we have to listen more to what the rest of the world are talking about, to try and really deep understand, right, their perspectives. I mean, we talk about a competition of narratives from different powers, and we really need to understand that why some narratives and perspectives resonate with other people, and to be able then to deal with that. So to me, the key is for the West, if they want to shape a new global order, to go back in some way to the fundamentals of actually the post-World War II world, right? When we have the UN Charter, the fundamental principles that are enshrined in the UN Charter that were accepted by all those who became members of the UN, to try to go back to this open, inclusive approach. Or at that time there were less power. So now we really need to engage in a dialogue to really talk about the kind of rules that would be fit for purpose for the 21st century, right? I think if you talk about promoting a rule-based order, there's much more resonance amongst the, but not a value-based order, because our values really, there can be some differences, but when you talk about coming together, because rules are made by us, together. If we can say that we come together to have a dialogue on some of the new rules, how to reform some of the existing rules, I think there will be much more acceptance. It will be a long process, of course. It will be difficult. There will be differences, but I think that is what we need to get back into, to talk about the coming together to discuss the new rules, reform existing rules that are fit for purpose for the new world system.
It's interesting, isn't it? There is a lot of engagement. US President Joe Biden has been to the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, ASEAN countries, have had a summit with the United States. The European Union is engaging on almost a daily basis in some form or the other with an Asian country. There is engagement, but I'm not sure that we're actually working towards what happens tomorrow. How do we redefine the rules-based order, as you're saying? How do we reform it, change it, make it more inclusive? Sven, you wrote very recently also about a multipolar world, and you said, President Vladimir Putin has regularly clamored for multipolarity. What he really meant when he did that was an end to perceived American unipolarity. What he did not want, you say, but he has now provoked, is an international arena ruled by actual multipolarity, in which he has to compete for the support of other states. It's a very fascinating conversation. So please tell us what you think.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, Russia for a long time, since 2007 or so, has been clamoring for multipolarity. But I think somehow with the idea that it would be Russia and China then that would team up against the United States. But what they see now is that in this war, China basically adopts a middle position. For sure, rhetorically, it stays quite close to Russia, but the practice of their policy is more akin to non-intervention. They definitely do not reduce their relations with Russia, but they also don't do anything more to support it. So suddenly, I think Russia, I hope, must realize that in a multipolar world, you have to fend for yourself. That's what it means, basically. Russia cannot really coerce many countries into supporting it, so it will have to entice countries into supporting it. But what does it have to offer? That, I think, is the true reality of a multipolar world. And I think Putin has maneuvered Russia into a corner, in which it is even more dependent on China than it already was. But it also works for us, I think, in a multipolar world. It's not sufficient that other countries know what you are against. I think they also need to know what you are in favor of. What do you have to offer to the world? China sets the tone of the conversation with its Belt and Road Initiative. Certainly not everything that is touched by BRI turns into gold, far from it. But, it does set the tone. And so the EU now has a global gateway, basically our reply to the BRI. And I do think that is of massive strategic importance. But we must now do it and say to other countries, look, we certainly don't expect you to kick out the Chinese. It would be rather hypocritical on our side. But be smart and diversify, like any investor, and take up also, to some extent, the European offer. But the offer must be put on the table now. There must be investment funds. And that may be the hitch, of course, given that there will be big needs also within Europe.
So in this complex world that we're talking about, where countries have agency, where they're not accepting binary options, where they're demanding to be included in any kind of reform or any rewriting of the global governance agenda, I was just wondering, from your point of view, Hwee, what is the EU's position in that? I don't mean how do they see it, but what would you like the European Union to be doing? Because let's be very frank, we ourselves in Europe the European Union is multilateral. The European Union is used to forging compromises, negotiating, working with countries that it always doesn't agree with necessarily. So there is a sense of compromise in the European Union. And I would argue that gives us a certain degree of strength and agility to work, let's say, in a very nimble fashion in this new world order or disorder at the moment. What's your point of view?
So I think the EU should go back to its fundamental, right? The focus on multilateralism. I mean, I think, of course, because of the geopolitical realities and all that, the EU now wants to position itself as a geopolitical power. And indeed, if we accept the word as it is, you need to talk about hard power, soft power, and all that. But the EU, after all, is good at this ability. They have the capacity, the political will to really do all the hard slog about coming up with new rules, new standards to govern new areas of cooperation, right? So this is where the EU's strength is. And I think, so we are moving towards a multipolar world. To me, as an academic, when I talk about multipolar world, it's based on the sense of power, right? The poles of attraction is just about power. But we need to go back to this whole thing about rules, the rule-based order that we want to build. And the EU strength is really about rules making. We always call EU a regulatory power, right? They are good. They have the the capacity and the will to work on all these complex rules and try and accommodate, compromise with people. And so that is the EU strength. And I think EU should not forget that and got so sucked into this whole thing about we will also want to be a geopolitical power and forgot that they are what their strength is. I mean, to me, that is my hope that the EU will continue to build on that strength and play on its strength and really help to bring the different countries, as I said, to the table to look at the new rules that are needed for the for the 21st century.
Sven, what's your point of view? Do you think the European Union can take on this role as being a kind of convener for a new rule-based governance agenda globally? Do you think we have that strength and that appetite for that?
I would say we at least have to try it because who else is going to try and play a leading role? Not China, not Russia, and US. We can't be sure. My perception is that in the United States, even the Democrats have somewhat disengaged from deep multilateralism. So I think we definitely have to be more proactive. I mean, the EU has been talking about effective multilateralism since 2003, in the first European security strategy. But I think in recent years, I haven't seen so much attempts at leadership. And I'm thinking both at reviving existing multilateral structures, but also just making new ad hoc informal groups of countries that are like-minded on a specific issue and have an interest in finding a concrete solution. Countries that include both democracies and non-democracies, but that take things forward. My sort of line these days is that this should be the EU project to maintain one world, so to maintain one world order, one core set of rules to which the majority of states subscribe, because it provides them a political and certainly also financial economic stability that they need to pursue their interests. But it really will demand, I think, a strong leadership role. The difficulty, I think, is that we will have to accept that if we want to maintain all states in the system, we will have to make more compromises maybe than before. I mean, the current world order was basically created by the US and UK, 1944-45. I don't think that makes it less legitimate because other states afterwards subscribe to it. But now if you need to, in some areas, adapt to rules, or you open up new policy areas, you want to write new rules, you're not just going to quickly settle the thing between Brussels and Washington. You'll have to bring in Beijing at least, and so make a deal with them. But of course, making a deal to keep Beijing in the system only makes sense if in the end they respect the rules of the systems. Otherwise, and that's balancing act, I think, between Beijing, Washington, and Brussels has yet to be found.
Hwee, so very quickly now, because we're coming towards the end of our podcast, this kind of trilateral kind of leadership that Sven is talking about, do you think that would be acceptable to other countries in the so-called global south?
I would expand it. I think, we have been talking now, if you want to focus on multilateralism, back to building multilateralism, you really need to engage a lot of the middle powers, right? And so I think just focusing on the three so-called big poles, or the EU and China, would not be sufficient. And that's why I was quite excited when EU and ASEAN so-called enter into a strategic partnership, because I thought, and of course ASEAN has its problems and all that, but I think fundamentally we also, as a regional organization of small states, we believe in we believe in a rule-based multilateral order. Right. Of course, we may again have some different interpretations about what multilateralism means, but overall, there is a certain consensus that we need to have rules that is important for small states. So I think we really need to engage many of the other middle powers in order to be a much more inclusive process. And I think, of course, it's again like what you would end up with much more compromises, and of course it may be quite long drawn. But again, in making multilateralism, I think we also need multilateralism, which means you can have in some way like working groups of nations sort of more focused on a specific area, that you want a certain set of rules to govern that area. And in that sense, to come together with these different working groups to come up with the rules that in the end will be open and for discussions, but at least they draft, in the sense of draft the kind of framework, a broad framework that allow then further inputs from the rest.
Sven, very finally, what role do you think think tanks have to play in this new era that we've entered into, in terms of, rewriting certain rules, asking for more discussion, more engagement, and moving away from this feared, for many of us, one world, two systems scenario?
I suppose our role should be really to keep open a dialogue. So not just talk to our own governments and polities, but for me, a key role is also that we maintain at least a think tank channel open between everybody, between Europe, China, the ASEAN countries, the US, but also ideally still Russia. And I don't think it makes sense now to totally block all dialogue with Russia, certainly not among academics. That must be possible. And I think from there can grow understanding and so on. Hopefully that will then percolate upwards to the political level. But if we as think tankers and academics stop the effort to understand the logic of the other player, then nobody will try that.
So Hwee, from your point of view as well, I mean, track 2 has always been such an important part of our culture in Europe, but also in the Asia Pacific. Do you think that is a key also? We should be part of this conversation?
Definitely, I think, because think tanks, like what Sven said, we should be open-minded. We should not self-censor ourselves. We should be open to dialogue, to help find a pathway, take on difficult topics sometimes, because politically, of course, for the politicians, there are certain political costs when emotions are high on some of the issues. But the think tanks, as we are the ones, we are trying to be more rational in our and more academic and to try and also adopt long-term thinking. So that's a very important role that think tanks should play.
Thank you very much indeed. And exactly that's what we're trying to do with these MENA Talks podcast. We're trying to engage in a conversation about the future. As we've said, it's going to be a complicated puzzle. It's going to have its perils, but also many opportunities there for countries to work together and to avoid a scenario where we're split into two opposing camps. Thank you so much indeed, Professor Sven Biscop, for joining us for this conversation. And to you also, Professor Hwee, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, everyone who's been listening. Thank you very much indeed. Tune in soon for the next episode of the MENA Talks podcast. This is Shada Islam in Brussels saying thank you, stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and North Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.